In this video, we're going to get started with CSS. Robbins mentions the CSS Zen Garden website in her book. The site had been retired for a while, but now the site has had some new changes and updates, and they demonstrate how much can be done with CSS. For each one of these pages at the CSS Zen Garden site, the HTML is exactly the same. The only thing that's different is the external CSS file. So how does this work? I'm going to start here with a simple HTML document. We have a heading, an image, a few paragraphs, and a list with another list embedded. So how do we get from something like this to something like the CSS Zen Garden examples? First, we're going to make an external CSS file. There are three ways we could add CSS to this document. We could embed CSS styles within the head of the document. We could embed CSS styles within individual HTML tags, or we could create a separate standalone CSS document and attach it to this one. The last method is the preferred method in all cases, because by having an external style sheet, you can apply it to more than one HTML document. This is efficient because then if you've got lots of pages on your site, you could make one change in one CSS document and it would affect every page in your entire site. So how am I going to make this CSS file? I start with a new blank file in my text editor, Atom, and I'm just going to start by writing a style rule. I'm going to write a rule for the body element. You'll notice that a style rule is enclosed in these curly braces. So you want to make sure everything for one rule goes in between that one set of curly braces. In this rule, I'm going to change the background of the body. I'm going to give it a color, which I happen to have over here in Color Picker. So I'm copying the color code and I'm going to make a hash mark and paste, and the CSS declaration has to end with a semicolon. Now I'll save this file as main.css and the Atom colors will come into the document. Note the file extension is .css, and I'm saving this inside a folder named styles. It could be named CSS. Usually it's one of those two. And that folder, styles, it's inside my project folder. So I'll switch to my HTML file. How does this file know that there's a CSS file associated with it? Well, right now it doesn't know. There's no association at all. There's a particular HTML element to create the link between the CSS file and the HTML file. And appropriately enough, it's called the link element. So the link element must go inside the head element, and it looks like this. It has an href attribute, and it has a new attribute you haven't seen before called rel, R-E-L. Rel stands for the relationship between the source and the destination, for the link tag or some other tags. For the link to a style sheet, rel is always style sheet. It has to be lowercase and it has to be one word, and it's enclosed in quotation marks just like the value for any attribute. The href is the path to this style sheet. So remember, it's inside a folder named styles, so I have to type styles / and then the name of the file, which we can see is main.css. By typing this link tag, and it's one of the empty elements, it does not have a closing tag. By typing this link tag in the head of my document and saving, I will have linked the HTML document and the CSS file together, which allows the styles to come into the HTML. When I go to my page in the browser, as soon as I reload, we're going to see that style take effect. So since body applies to the entire page, the background color that I put in has been applied to the whole page. Now in this case, we began with a finished HTML document. All the structure and the text markup was already complete. We've written all the tags to match the structure of our content. That's step 1. We've also done step 3 already. We've attached the style sheet to the HTML document. Step 2 is we need to write the rules for all of our styles. So far, we only have one rule, and that rule applies to the one selector, body. So now let's add some more declarations to that one rule, the one for body. I'm going to change the font family. We'll be talking more about this in a later video, but it's an easy thing to see when we change the font. So let's set the default font size for the page, save and reload, and immediately I can see that the font has changed. And maybe I think, this is a little bit small. Maybe I'd like to make the font bigger. So I'll come back to the CSS. Let's change the font size in the paragraphs only. So I'll make a new rule that applies to P elements. Let's make the font size 200%, a lot bigger, and save and reload, and we instantly see a huge change. Maybe that's a little bit too much, too big, so let's go back to the CSS. Let's try 140%, save and reload. Maybe that looks more reasonable. Let's do one more thing to the paragraphs. Let's add a background color of white. White is 3 Fs, and always end the declaration with the semicolon. Save and reload. Now here's where you realize that every HTML element, like the P element, has some styles that it inherits from the browser. Look at the line spaces separating the paragraphs. We did not put those into our CSS. They have been added by this browser, Chrome, and they might be slightly different in another browser or on a phone. In other words, the browser imposes some styles, but we could specify the size of these spaces in our CSS, and then the amount of space would be consistent on every device. Also, look at how the list is formatted differently from the paragraphs. When we made the font larger for the P element, it had no effect at all on the UL element, the list. To explain that, let's look at this list of what Robbins in Chapter 11 calls the big concepts. We'll learn more about these as we go forward with CSS, but for now, as far as inheritance goes, keep in mind that children inherit from their parents. Parent elements contain child elements. So child elements are inside their parent. So when we put a background color on body, that became the background color of everything on the page because body is the parent of everything. So when we changed the font family for body, it also changed it for everything on the page. When we added a background color to the P element, it affected all the P elements on the page, and it overrode the background color that was produced by our body rule in the CSS. But the background color for the P did not affect the background of the list element, the UL, because the P and the UL are siblings. They're side by side. They're equal. They don't inherit from each other. So the P is not the parent of the UL. The UL is not the parent of the P. So what you do to one of those elements has no effect on the other. This is an important idea to understand how inheritance works in CSS. The second important concept, the cascade. It seems related to inheritance, but actually it's different. It concerns how the order of the styles affects the document. So we saw that the browser's built-in styles for margins above and below a paragraph were not affected when we wrote a new rule for the P element. All the browser's CSS styles for the P remained in effect except for the two that we changed for the P, the background color and the font size. Sometimes for large websites, you may attach more than one external style sheet to the page, and the cascade dictates that the last style sheet attached will override any conflicting styles in the previously listed style sheets. So the cascade is a matter of order, and we'll do a demonstration of that in a moment. We'll talk more about the box model when you learn about margins and padding in a later video. For now, we'll just use the P element again as a simple example of the box model. When I added the white background to all the P elements, you saw the line of space above and below the P element. That's the margin of the P element. So every element, whether it's block or inline, has top, right, bottom, and left margins. Every element also has padding on all four sides inside the element and a potential border on the four sides. The box model means every element in HTML has all those properties, margin, padding, and border, and we can change them with CSS. Like I said, we'll go into that in more detail in a later video. Finally, let's talk about grouped selectors. We'll show an example of this. You remember that what we did to the P element did not affect the UL element at all? So what if we wanted the list to look exactly the same as the paragraphs? You might think that we'd have to write a new rule for the UL, but in fact it's easier than that. You can put more than one selector into a rule, so grouped selectors. So what I've just done is I have added the selector, the element, UL, as a selector to the same rule that's already written for the P, and when I save it and reload, you'll see that it had the expected effect. With one exception, and that is the UL that's embedded inside another UL got a double font size. So we're going to fix that by addressing just ULs that are inside other ULs, and we're going to tell them to inherit their font size, and that fixes it. So don't lose track of what I was demonstrating. Grouping selectors, you can put more than one selector in a CSS rule, and then everything in that rule, every declaration is going to affect both of those elements. In this case, the UL and the P both have the same background, both have the same font size. Now let's talk a little more about the cascade and how things affect one another. What if I didn't want the UL to be exactly the same as the P, but I didn't want to change the CSS I've already written here? Let's say I want the list background to be a gray color. All right, so save and reload. And now I've changed the background color of the UL element. But what happens if I take that new rule I just wrote and I cut it and I paste it up here above the rule that affects both the UL and the P? Save and reload. The same rule that made the U element gray just a moment ago is now having absolutely no effect. And why not? This is the cascade. It's not having any effect because this rule that makes the UL background gray is overridden by the one that comes after it. This is not the same as inheriting. This is the cascade. It is how the lower thing affects the upper thing. The easy rule to remember is the last one always wins. The last rule or the last declaration always overwrites any conflicting style that came before or above. That's it for our introduction to CSS. Next, we'll get into more specifics about spacing, margins, padding, and controlling the layout of pages.